I'll be concentrating perhaps a lot on the actual trauma system and not necessarily so much on Melbourne Health. But having said that, for those of you, and I think there's probably quite a few, you may not realise that there is another trauma service in the state. So bear with me while I just give you a brief, if I'm pressing the right button, brief. There you go, failed the first test. The Royal Melbourne Hospital has been around a long time. It was first opened its doors in 1830 in a little cottage, rapidly outgrew that, and a new hospital was built in Lonsdale Street, which again it outgrew over about 60 years. And then just post-war, the current building was occupied by the Royal Melbourne Hospital after the Americans had left. And it has grown since that time. Germane to today is the designation of the hospital in 1999 as a major trauma service. And of course, we became a true trauma service when the helipad opened several years later. And now we sort of are shrinking in the shadow of this architecturally beautiful comprehensive cancer centre. We do have access via 2 walkways. The top one gets you to the coffee, and that gets you to the intensive care, beautiful. And we do, the benefits for us have of course been that we, with the building of the centre, a very large intensive care which we all share. Why are we talking about trauma? Well, it's quite obvious everybody realises the enormous burden that trauma has on society, and it's been this graph here demonstrates the influence of age on your ability to survive trauma. And we always imagine that the most people who die as a result of trauma, they're young and reckless. But in fact, it's far less dramatic than that. There's a very large burden on the elderly who succumb from minor trauma. So these are the challenges. Now, Victoria has been, or Australia has been a leader in trauma prevention strategies, and these, you can see, have produced that very dramatic reduction in the deaths due to trauma. I would like to say that our trauma system played a large part, but I think that this has been overall related to the seat belts, things that we now can't imagine were difficult to introduce in the first instance, but it's gone on and on with a reduction throughout, although things have just had a slight increase in more recent years, but still a very wonderful story. However, all wasn't all as good as it may seem, because several reports appeared in the 1990s suggesting that there was a sizable preventable mortality rate. Now, the methodology that was used by Frank McDermott was very laborious, and he's to be congratulated on an extraordinary effort. But like all this preventability, of course, it comes down to personal opinion of the group. There was no sort of really good scientific measure. However, it was somewhat distressing to think that maybe up to 40% of the deaths from trauma, this is both pre-hospital and hospital, could be preventable. This was followed up by another paper that came out several years later, and this looks at in-hospital death and complication rates, and again suggested that possibly up to 40% of the survivors had either a complication or died or were left with a disability that may have been avoidable. So this was the gauntlet that was thrown down to the government, and they really ran with this in really quite rapidly. First of all, setting up a ministerial task force which looked at to advise the government on the best way forward. Within a year, they'd produced this most impressive document, the report on trauma and emergency services, published in 1999. There were over 100 recommendations that could be used as a foundation stone for establishing the Victorian state trauma system. We call this the Rotes report. Thomas Cospin, I think, called it the Roties Report, which always reminded me of that sort of potatoes thing they make in Austria. However, this really outlined all the steps that would be necessary to establish this. The result was, in fact, a year later, the beginning of the Victorian state trauma system. Victoria, of course, was an ideal state to have a system which was an integrated trauma care designed to achieve optimal outcomes for all trauma patients in the state. As I was saying, it was Victoria seemed an excellent state to have one because we have our relatively small size and our population, with 98% of people living within a extended helicopter ride. So it would mean that it was possible that you could have graded facilities available, levels with graded resources. So the goal was to deliver the right patient at the right hospital at the shortest time. What was the right patient and what was the right hospital? These things were all laid out in the way in which the system was set up. Every healthcare facility was given a designation which outlined the resources and their capabilities, and hence you would know what the hospital you're going to had to offer, and then by a triage system that was established, you would be able to assess the likelihood that the patient was suffering from a major injury and would require, or what level of care they would require. And at the top of that pyramid are the major trauma services, of which there are 3, 2 adult, 1 paediatric, but all the way along the line there are places that can provide care. As I say, it was all fueled by the triage guidelines, which allowed you to identify, or allow us to identify, those patients which are potentially more severely injured, and not surprisingly, it was those people who've got deranged physiology would be the ones most at risk, and then the nature of the injuries that had been occurred, assessed at the site, and then other factors such as age came into the equation. So that's where I come from, and this is the perspective that I have, which I was going to briefly share with you from the state system. Now, as an important part of the establishment of the state system is that there would be integral to it a monitoring system, which is a very extensive and laborious process of data collection that occurs throughout. Now, as a major trauma centre, then similar to what David Waters said, of course we have our own internal systems to ensure that we're happy with our performance. It's not it doesn't differ, I'm sure, all that much from most major hospitals. We do have a weekly audit meeting with particular emphasis on deaths, but then we're backed up by having an internal arrangement of committees to oversee trauma, with an advisory committee, the audit. We have a cascade process with a weekly, then a quarterly, and then an annual audit is done where all the deaths are compiled. And at the annual audit, we gather as much comparative data as we can so that we see where we fit in the league table. Really, this is predominantly across Victoria. In addition, we do provide feedback to all referring hospitals. We give them an assessment of, or we compile the management that they have given and then compare that to what would be expected. Was the amount of fluid given in transit appropriate? Were the patients given oxygen? Were they ventilated appropriately, etc.? So we make no judgments, but we simply outline what had happened, giving them an accompanying information on what was the expected management. At a state level, we then all the data we collect, as I say, we have a complex data set on all trauma patients. This we send to the Victorian State Trauma Registry on a quarterly basis. This is all collated and then they produce an annual report. The state system is a comprehensive one. It's supported by the Victorian State Trauma Committee, and there is also a case review group which reviews all the cases that are sent to it, and then we filter out cases that don't meet compliance with the recommendations as to which hospital they should be sent to and whether or not the appropriate mode of transport was arranged. This quality group then reviews these cases, and if there have been deficiencies or in their management, then that is reported back directly to the health service. Initially, there were only reports sent for people to contemplate, but then the department became a little bit more active and then requested in a number of cases that a report comes back to the department to perhaps explain why the patient wasn't managed according to the agreed guidelines. And that little wiggly chart down the bottom there, which is not just for decoration, but you can see that the number of reports that were sent out dramatically seemed to drop about in December 2013, which is the time when we were asking for reports to come back. So whether or not it's cause and effect, I'm not sure, but we'd like to think that was probably the case. All of this information, it does appear on the annual report, which is open to the public for people to and for hospitals to review. So there's a lot of information going to and fro. This has now all been extended even further, and there is now an Australian trauma registry. It's still somewhat in its infancy. None of the other states have a comprehensive total population system like we have, or audit like we have in Victoria, but more and more data is being developed. I'm not saying that critically. Can you imagine the difference between trying to gather data in Western Australia in comparison to Victoria? You know, the task would be just enormous. However, it is anticipated that as we get more and more data, we'll be able to better benchmark with the various states, and this also will include New Zealand as well. So it'll give us a very wide-ranging group of sites. At the moment, the data, each state remains somewhat anonymous, although people kind of get the idea. You can tell by the number of cases perhaps which state it came from, but I won't go into that. But however, we hope that this will inspire improvement overall in the trauma care. The college also helps with ensuring that we benchmark our care of our patients. There is a trauma verification process. This has been taken up much better in New South Wales, surprisingly, who don't have a state system than here in Victoria. But this is, again, a group from the college, and it's not only the College of Surgeons, but it's in combination with the College of Anaesthetists, Intensive Care and Emergency Medicine, and they have an agreed set of standards that we feel a major trauma service should comply with, and if they'd first of all do a visit, make recommendations, come back and review in about a year's time, and if those recommendations have been adopted and accepted, then verification is given. One of the difficulties is knowing exactly what do you measure. You know, what is a true measure of the quality of your care, and this is being debated. We've tended to use international benchmarks as the basis. Things: how long is the patient at the scene? What's the length of time? Was the patient intubated in a timely fashion? Are they getting their life-saving surgery done as quickly as is appropriate? Are they languishing too long in the wards with their long bone fractures, etc.? Well, we think it does work, but of course there are many things that would have affected the death rate over this time from 2011 to 2016 when you reflect on that chart where other accident prevention was introduced, and cars have got better since 11 and 12, and people are driving later model cars, for example. However, overall, there was a continued drop in the death rate, and surprisingly, though, it is in the elderly group that the most advances have been seen. And you'll see in the greater than 84, which is at the very top, it's gone down from 40 to 35. 25 to about 15 in the next group, the 75 to 84s. In the very young, the 65 to 74 group, they've still been an improvement. That was a joke. But if you don't look too hard at it, it's a little bit disappointing in the age group 45 to 64. There has been a slight kick up in the mortality. Exactly what that means, I'm not sure. But however, we do feel that the state system is providing good care, timely care for our patients. We do have a system that we can monitor it, and hopefully we'll see continuing improvements. The challenge with this, as everybody I think has alluded to, is the difficulty in collecting this data. Nobody's been able to reproduce that first audit that Frank McDermott did. That took several years of Friday night meetings with surgeons to go over the cases. It was not a very popular exercise, and it'd be hard to imagine that we'll ever be able to muster one as good, but that's the only way we'll be able to know whether or not we are really making a difference to the preventable mortality and morbidity. Thank you.